Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am very excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Sandro Galea, discussing his new book, The Contagion Next Time. He is joined tonight in conversation by Arianna Huffington, and we will also have an introduction by Bradley Campbell of the CLF. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. Our fall season is in full swing and you don't want to miss out on our lineup. Make sure to check out our event schedule on harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. We also suggest if you want to get Christmas gifts this year, shop early and shop local. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of The Contagion Next Time, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual series wouldn't be possible. Thank you so much for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Tonight's event has the option to be closed captioned. If you would like to see closed captions on your screen, there will be a button where you can use that option. Now I am so excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Sandro Galea is the professor at the Boston University School of Public Health. He has been named an epidemiologist innovator by Time and one of the world's most influential scientific minds by Thomas Reuters. He has served as a field physician for Doctors Without Borders and held academic positions at Columbia University, University of Michigan, and the New York Academy of Medicine. At the time of his current appointment, he is the youngest dean of a school of public health in the United States. He is joined by Arianna Huffington. Arianna is the co-founder, and she is the founder and CEO of Thrive Global, the founder of the Huffington Post, and the author of 15 books, including Thrive and the Sleep Revolution. In 2016, she launched Thrive Global. She has been named by Time Magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential people and Forbes' most powerful women's list. Tonight, they're discussing The Contagion Next Time. I'll leave you with this quote from Katie Couric. Dr. Galea's book proves it is possible for us to build a healthier world after COVID-19. And our first step is to protect the most vulnerable, whether they're in our own neighborhoods or across the globe. The Contagion Next Time is truly a must read. Now I'll turn things over to Brad to introduce the CLF, which is our co-sponsor. Brad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you to the Harvard Bookstore for having CLF co-sponsor this event. And thanks to all of you who've joined us for what I know will be a compelling conversation with Dean Galea, moderated by the formidable Arianna Huffington. For those of you not familiar with Conservation Law Foundation, CLF wields the power of the law, the markets, and science to create a healthier, cleaner, more just, and thriving New England for all. During the pandemic, the communities we serve that suffer worst and first from pollution and climate change, places like Chelsea, Massachusetts, invariably turned out to be the hotspots for COVID. Dr. Galea's leadership and scholarship have been both instructive and inspirational for us in helping understand the broader public health context of both environmental and social determinants of health. And The Contagion Next Time deepens that understanding. I look forward to a very engaging discussion, and I'm delighted to turn it over to Arianna.
Thank you so much. Thank you for co-sponsoring this event, and thank you for all the work you are doing. And thank you to Sandro for writing this book. I think you can now unmute yourself, and great, we can all see you. I have loved the book. I've had it on my nightstand for a few weeks now. So these are still the uncorrected proofs, heavily underlined and with many post-its. it's such an important book because, Sandro, as you say in the introduction, in 2017, Time ran a cover story titled "Warning, We Are Not Ready for the Next Pandemic." And then, despite widespread understanding that we were indeed not ready, we did not make the changes that had to happen to be ready. And so the Contagion Next Time is really urging us to not repeat that same mistake and get us ready for next time. So please tell us how you see that, what you see as the main priorities we are ignoring and what we can do to be ready next time.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you to Arianna. Thank you for being in conversation. Thank you, Brad and the CLF for hosting. And thank you to the Audrey and the Harvard Bookstore for arranging this. So Arianna, since you led off with the introduction, maybe I'll read a small segment from the epilogue.
Yes.
That goes off with bracketing. And by the way, this is what the book actually looks like when it's past the uncorrected proofs. So let me read 2 paragraphs from the epilogue, which I think address your question. COVID-19 was not just a virus. It was a story of our collective health, our vulnerability, and our resilience. This overarching narrative emerged from many smaller narratives. There was the political narrative of the pandemic and the story of governments working to respond to an unprecedented threat. There was the economic narrative lived across a variety of scales, from multinational corporations scrambling to adapt to changing workplace realities, to the dinner tables around which many people, newly unemployed, worked out monthly expenses. It was a global story, as an epidemic that started in China, crossed provincial and then international borders to engulf the world. But at a deeper level, it was the story of individuals, each trying to navigate the difficulties of the moment, the sick and the well, those who recover from the disease, and those who succumb to it. And just as the broader narrative of COVID-19 is anchored in those individual stories, each of these stories has something to say about the foundational forces that shape the arc of the pandemic. So that paragraph, or paragraph and a half, captures the essence of what I'm trying to do with this book. And I refer to the Time 2017 cover story, which is a very good issue of Time. I think they did their usual comprehensive job of saying these are things we should look at. But that issue focused entirely on the biology and of our biomedical approach to stopping the pandemic, on the vaccines, on the treatments, and did not stop to recognize that the pandemic ultimately will be experienced as a social, economic phenomenon. That how we experience the pandemic depends on the health of our politics, depends on the health of our economic structures, depends on our actual health and whether we were healthy enough to be resilient to the virus. And of course, that actual health depends on years, decades, and centuries of how prior marginalization has inflicted poor health on particular groups who then went on to become vulnerable to the ravages of the pandemic. All of those forces are what shaped how we experience the moment. All of those forces are shaped how we experience the pandemic. And I suppose my argument is that if we pay attention only to vaccines, to surveillance, we, for the next contagion, the next pandemic, we will still have the same tragedy that we had now. Because while it is important to focus on vaccines, to focus on treatments, to focus on surveillance, that is necessary, but not sufficient. And what I'm trying to do with this book is to inject these other elements into our conversation.
Because as you write in the book, we are still thinking of health and healthcare in terms of doctors, medicine, hospitals, today vaccines, booster shots. But you think this is the wrong way of thinking about health and that we need to think much more broadly. Tell us more about that part, the broad part.
Yeah, so let's address that by discussing the single biggest health achievement of the past 200 years. So in all of human history, life expectancy for human beings, our species, was about 40. This is for millennia, until about the 1800s. From the 1800s, we started a slow creep up, and in just 200 years, life expectancy in high-income countries now is close to 80. That's a doubling of human life expectancy in 200 years, which is really the blink of an eye in the 100,000 years that humans have been around, our species has been around. Now, why did that happen? Well, that happened because we cleaned up cities. We cleaned up our air. We developed access to safe food and drinkable water. We reduced our exposure to violence. We moved closer towards having housing for more people than we had before. We made sure that we were no longer being subject to dying from accidents in workplaces. We had reasonable wages in order to be able to afford a quality of life where one could balance living with working. Those were all the forces that fundamentally doubled our life expectancy over the past 150 to 100 years or so. Notice, I never once mentioned medicine in any of that. Now, medicine is important, medicine is critical, but medicine helps us in particular at the extremes of life. Medicine helps us when we're older age, very young, or when we're sick. But fundamentally, what makes long, healthy lives is the world around us. And that's an appreciation which, at some level, it's obvious, but at another level, it's utterly radical, because around the kitchen tables around the country, when people talk about their health, we often resort to, my health is caused by my doctor. No, it's not. Our doctor's job is to make us healthy once we're sick. But in order to be healthy, we need the world around us, and we would rather all be healthy rather than be sick.
And of course, I completely agree with you that we need the world around us, that we need all the social determinants of health. But also, what about the individual choices we make? During the beginning of the pandemic, Van Jones, and nobody can question his commitment to activism and improving the conditions of the work around us, wrote a piece on Thrive, in which he described his own health and his high cholesterol and all the things he was dealing with that he felt made him a candidate for not dealing well with COVID. And he started making changes, individual changes in his own health. And he wrote that being a tireless and formidable opponent of systemic injustice, despite that, he was someone whom COVID-19 could easily kill. So his point is that it's a false choice, to say it's either what the government can do to take more responsibility for ending the structural systems of racism and the world around us. And also he thinks that people need to take more responsibility for their own individual health choices.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, gets at the heart of the book. So let me address that question with a metaphor first, and then maybe I'll do another small reading, another chapter from the book.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest successes of health of the past 100 years is how much we have reduced death from driving. So right now, for every vehicle mile one drives, your chance of dying in a car is 200 times less than it was 100 years ago, 200 times, enormous difference. Now, here's my question. Is that because drivers are 200 times safer than they were 100 years ago? Of course not. Drivers are, anybody who drives in Boston, the city where I live, knows that drivers are not very good now, let alone 100 years ago. The reason that we die so much less in cars, right, is because we have seatbelts and airbags and shatterproof glass, and we make sure that we don't drive when we're under the influence of alcohol. Now, within the changed world around us that makes our cars safer, a safe driver still is going to have less chance of dying than an unsafe driver. So this is why the two are not in contradiction.
Yes.
Of course, it's true that the safe driver is going to have less chance of an accident, but the safe driver is now in a much safer context, and the unsafe driver is in a much safer context. So to come back to the Van Jones, and this argument is often used to say, well, if you exercise and you eat healthy, you're going to be healthier. Well, of course. But if you exercise and eat healthier within a world where you can exercise, where you're not afraid of going outside and getting shot in your neighborhood, within a world where you actually have access to food that has nutrients and it's not calorie dense, nutrient poor. That is then the intersection of the individual behavior and the context. And in the context of, Van Jones mentions race and economic status. I think it's really important to recognize that one of the lessons of the pandemic was that minority groups, people of color, particularly Black Americans, bore a disproportionate burden of COVID-19 in large part because of the history of disadvantage and greater burden of disease that Black Americans have borne over the past centuries. Let me read one more paragraph from the book, if I may. So this paragraph goes like this. I chose to call this book, The Contagion Next Time, in homage to James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. In his book, Baldwin engages with the issue of race in America and how we need to think differently about this subject in order to create a better society. Baldwin's book, this book argues for a similar change in perspective around health. It also recognizes the ineluctable role that reckoning with race has to play in America if we are to create a better, healthier country. If we are to prevent the next pandemic, we need to engage with the forces that shape health to create a world that is resistant to contagion. We need to stop prioritizing medicine over the core drivers of health and start addressing deep-seated racial and socioeconomic injustices. Absent this change, we risk seeing not merely a repeat of COVID-19, but an amplification of it in the form of a contagion from which we may not collectively be able to recover. So I think issues of race color so much of the experience in this country that they're inseparable from some of the things that happen. And maybe one concrete example, which I trace a little bit in the book, would be helpful. So the reason why there was such a gap between Black American death and white American death is in no small part because Black Americans had higher risk of acquiring COVID. Now, why is that? Well, let's just trace it back. Crowding in homes is a risk factor for more people in contact, more risk of contact, more risk of getting COVID. Black Americans live in more crowded homes than white Americans. Now, why is that? Let's trace it back. Well, the reason for that is because historically, African Americans have been denied the opportunity to invest in homes and to have wealth that carries over into larger, better homes. Why is that? Well, it's because in the 1930s, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation was established to help banks lend to Americans to buy homes, the Homeowners Loan Corporation went through the practice of redlining, where it would take African-American neighborhoods, color them in red, and say to banks, you don't really want to invest there. Now, why is that? Well, that emerges from the Jim Crow era, which came after slavery, which came after hundreds of years of disenfranchisement of Black Americans. So history writes itself on the health of a particular group all the way to the present. And one could tell similar stories about Indigenous Americans, one could tell similar stories about Latinx Americans, one could tell similar stories about immigrants and low-wage laborers. So there are many different groups that bore the disproportionate brunt of COVID-19 because ultimately a pandemic like this finds its way into us through the social and economic structures that shape the world that the pandemic hits.
You're so right. And that is so incredibly important because even though so many people and institutions pay lip service to the importance to address all these factors, the truth is that the majority, vast majority, over 90% of our resources is spent at meeting people at the point of failure, after they're sick. And so truly, what you are saying and writing could not have come at a better time. The question is, if you put your optimist hat on,
yes,
how quickly do you think, let's say we suddenly had the real public will to invest the resources we need into what has to be done and what you describe in the book so brilliantly has to be done. Let's say we started today. How long would it take to be able to have a real impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are things that could happen today that will have an impact. But I do think, and I think implicit in your question is that most of these things we're talking about will have most of their benefit across generations. And in many respects, that's okay. Like it actually does take generations to change truly foundational forces. I do think there are things that can happen in the short term. I think access to care. I think making sure that everybody has safe, affordable housing. I think making sure that everybody has a livable wage in order to be able to balance their work engagement with their life engagement, things that you've written about quite a bit. I think those could have an impact in the short term. But better childhood education will have an impact 25 years from now, 50 years from now. But that's okay, right? That is okay. That is what we should be doing as a world. Our goal is always to make sure the world is better when we leave it than when we enter it. And you said put your optimist hat on. And I found myself, since I've been talking about this book, very much doing that, leaning into optimism, because it's much better than the alternative. Optimism is I think it points to the fact that the world will become a better place, just like the world today is better than it was 50 years ago. And I don't want to ever forget that, because I think sometimes in this radical moment we're in, it's easy to forget that the world is better than it was. Like, if you give me a time machine and say, when do you want to be in time? I would say, I want to be in the future, not in the past, because the world is better today than it was. Now we take steps back, and God knows in the past 7 years it's been a messy time. It's been a messy time when sometimes it's felt like we've taken many steps back, but we actually are better. The very fact we're having these conversations is better. And you see it, you see interesting ideas emerging on the political stage. You see some flares of interesting ideas. And as somebody put it in a conversation recently, it's like we're having a renaissance of new ideas. And the awakening to deep-seated racial economic injustice that really came to a fore in 2020 was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary moment that should illuminate a path forward. And we are slowly doing that, a bit of a messy way, but slowly we're doing that.
I find, Sandro, that in the work we're doing at Thrive, for example, we're working with a lot of people who have been affected by these circumstances, historic circumstances, social determinants of health, but also by individual choices. And what we have found, I'll give you an example. We're working with millions of store associates at Walmart. And by helping them make better behavioral choices around food, around sleep, around movement, we have been able to dramatically affect their health. So I want us to keep stressing that, because people cannot wait for generations to see the impact. And if we can, through behavioral changes, change the outcomes of their health, reverse diabetes, put an end to hypertension, lose 30 or 70 pounds. These are meaningful changes that reduce the suffering of real people alive today and of their families. And, to hear people, and they write their stories, I should send you some of them, write how they've given up on fast food. They made the individual choice to cook instead of going to fast food restaurants. This is an individual choice that people can make today while we're tirelessly working on the systemic changes you are describing so eloquently in the book.
Yeah, and I have no disagreement with that. I would actually argue that the very systemic change is the fact that you're working with Walmart. We shouldn't forget that what you're doing is you actually are creating a context within which people can then make better choices and healthier choices. I go back to the car driving example, that by creating a safer car, we are now also creating an opportunity for the safer driver to be even healthier. And that's what you're doing. And so I agree completely that there are things that we can do in the short term that improve all of our lives. I also want to make sure, though, that we do not unduly blame individuals for poor behaviors, because I think we do that very much in our society. We stigmatize individuals by saying, you're not exercising enough and you're not eating enough. And that is, we know from the science that is utterly unhelpful and also not representative of the real challenges that people face in making the right decisions.
I completely agree with that. But I think we also need to make it clear that you can have these conversations and support people in making better choices without any judgments, any blame, but simply in order to be able to improve their lives and their health outcomes. So I think unless people blame them in some way, which would be truly unacceptable, I don't think we should shy from having these conversations.
I'm in agreement. And I'm delighted you're doing that with Walmart. I'd love to hear more about it.
Great. I'll send you more information. It actually will touch your heart to see the changes people are making. And, they're starting vegetable gardens and replacing processed foods and candy with tangerines and apples. And these are individual choices. And actually, a lot of these people then have more energy.
That's very cool.
Work for systemic changes. So, moving to another topic, I was very interested as I was reading the book to find out did the pandemic prompt you to write this book, or was this a topic you had been thinking about for a long time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the pandemic prompted me to write the book. I mean, for a book to come out in November of 2021, as you know, it means I wrote it in the second half of 2020, right? So it's like, I wrote it when we were 6 months into the pandemic. And the topic has been with me for a long time, and I've written things around it. And in some respects, the central theme that I'm proposing here is a central theme that was consistent with some previous books I've written. But I saw the pandemic as a teachable moment, and I'm now leaning on a term that we use in emergency medicine, which is my specialty, my medical specialty, emergency medicine. And the notion of teachable moment is sometimes, let's say, for example, you have somebody who's drinking too much, but then they come to the emergency department because they're drinking, they've broken a leg. Well, that's a teachable moment. You say, like, this, look at the tangible harm that you're doing. Now, can we address your drinking? And I feel like the pandemic is like that for us as a country. Now that we've been hit by this tragic circumstance with 700,000 Americans dying, which is, 700,000 mothers, fathers, aunts, grandparents, lovers, that is a teachable moment. And if we do not pay attention now, I don't know when we will.
And that's really what comes through the book, the fact that, you're also an epidemiologist.
I am.
So you come to the subject not just as a scholar and social scientist and observer of human nature, but also as an epidemiologist. So I want to ask you, in that capacity, what surprised you about the unfolding of COVID-19?
Yeah, so I suppose two answers to that. Number one, I mean, there were particularities about the viral mechanics that surprised everybody just because we did not know this virus. And I think I was as surprised as anybody else with the multiple waves, with the emergence of variants and all that. And in some respects, that's the biological characteristics of the virus. But I think if I were to label both a surprise, but also not a surprise, it's the extent to which the patterning of the consequence of this virus was so tightly linked to lived experience, to social reality. In that, I wrote a couple of pieces in March of 2020, just when this was coming out, and others did as well, saying, unless we're careful, what's going to happen is we're going to have a disproportionate burden of the virus, going to affect low-wage people, people of color, and it's exactly what happened. And in many respects, I was hoping that we wouldn't see that. At the beginning, I don't know if you remember, March, April of 2020, there was a whole lot of conversation, well, the virus, it can affect all of us, it doesn't discriminate and all that. What's not true. The virus did discriminate. Now, it wasn't the virus is a bug. The virus doesn't care what color we are, how much money we have, it doesn't care. But we set ourselves up in such a way that our context shaped who experienced the virus. And I think it was such a strong reminder of that. I think the virus was such a strong reminder of the fact that biology is intimately linked with our sociology. And, I'm an epidemiologist, and by label, I'm a social epidemiologist, which is a branch of epidemiology that concerns itself with how social factors, economic factors affect biology. And this was a paradigmatic example of everything that I've studied in my entire career, which is both terrible and also interesting at the same time.
And in the world that you occupy as an epidemiologist, how much are these issues of racial and social justice discussed? How much are they part of the conversation when you're among other health experts?
They have been part of the conversation for the past 20 years, growing part of the conversation. I think there is growing awareness, and in particular, what fills me with hope, to go back to hope and optimism, is that the wave of epidemiologists who are earlier in their career, for them, these factors are very present, clear and present, that they influence how they think and they shape the questions they ask. And I think the past 10 years has seen a real surge in attention to these fundamental issues, which is heartening to see. I think it's high time. And I think in many respects, it is the future of epidemiology. It's also the future closing the loop back with the past. Because if you think about the roots of epidemiology are in mid-19th century Western Europe and England and Germany. And really it emerged from counting disease in these industrializing cities like London and Berlin that had become these industrial hubs, and they were totally polluted. And the most famous story in epidemiology is of the cholera outbreak in 1856, where there was a cholera outbreak due to polluted water, and John Snow, who was the anesthesiologist to Queen Victoria, went door to door, mapped out the houses where people died, and was able to trace where the polluted water was coming from. That was the beginning of epidemiology as modern epidemiology today. That right there, right, was a close link between the virus, cholera at the time, the water, and the polluting influence of the city itself. So by coming this way, epidemiology really is closing the loop and going back full circle and saying epidemiology, our biomedical science, should be about the biology, the bug, the organism, and how all of that is influenced by and shapes the environment around us.
And also, you devote a lot of pages in the book to empathy and compassion.
Yes.
So as a scientist, you obviously focus on the biology, the bug, but also you focus on these human qualities.
Yeah. So
how necessary they are.
Yeah, and I've written about that, particularly for Thrive Global on your platform. Thank you to you for allowing me to do that. The compassion, to my mind, has to be at the heart of this kind of reasoning, and the reason is very simple. Compassion goes beyond empathy. Empathy says, I care for you, for your health, because I can see the world through your eyes, and therefore, if you suffer, I can imagine what that suffering is like. That's empathy. Compassion goes a step beyond that. That says, well, I can't really see the world through your eyes. I don't really know what your suffering is like, but I don't want you to suffer because we have a shared humanity. And I think that shared humanity sets the stage for saying we want to create a world that generates health for all of us. Now, what's interesting about the pandemic moment is that perhaps for the first time in recent memory, this was a stark moment of realization for everybody that our health is interlinked, that while compassion may be the value you want to aspire to, at a very pragmatic level, all of a sudden, it's better for me if you're not sick, because if you're sick, there's more virus around, which might mean that I might get sick. So the right thing to do from a moral perspective, from argument, from a place of compassion, also became the smart thing to do if we wanted to protect ourselves, which brings me back to why I think this is a teachable moment. This brings me back to why I say that now is the time for us to see our interconnection as humans and why we need to invest in the forces that make us all healthy, because unless we're all healthy, none of us really are healthy. And of course, we as a country have suffered from this problem of being not as healthy as we can be for decades.
Well, I love that. I think that's so important. And we see in so many aspects of our lives, a lot of teachable moments around connections that had not been made before. For example, planetary sustainability and personal sustainability. The data is clear that when people are burnt out, depleted, exhausted, they're in fight or flight survival mode. They don't care about the planet. When we don't care about the planet, or we don't care about fellow human beings or the world they live in, we are all going to be much more susceptible to the next pandemic. I love that we are making these connections because they're so often not made. And I think we've suffered from that. You even write in the book about your own medical profession and how they need more humility in dealing with all the new information and data that's coming. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think my argument for humility comes from recognizing the enormous complexity of the moment and of forces like this, of forces like the pandemic. It's a mistake to think we can predict the virus because it's all about the virus, because what the virus does depends as much as we've been discussing on the virus as it does on the world around us. And the world around us is very complex. So humility requires that we recognize that there is much that we do not know, and we should be approaching this with an open mind and open heart for the plurality of perspectives that can get us to the right place. It is also a bit of a call for listening to one another. And one of the challenges of the COVID moment has been this deepening, this sort of heartbreaking deepening of polarization in the population. This polarization, which of course we saw, and one could argue goes all the way went all the way to the White House when COVID emerged, and that polarization resulted in an arrogance on both sides of many of these arguments, which is there's a red approach to things and a blue approach to things, and of course that's not right. There is a human approach to trying to mitigate this virus, and it's neither red nor blue. So I think humility calls for us to recognize that we're dealing with highly complex phenomena in a complex world, and it requires that we listen to one another and recognize that there's a lot that we don't know.
And how does that figure in what we're dealing with in terms of vaccine resistance?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so the vaccine issue is a really, really important question, right? Because the vaccines were this enormous triumph. Like, it's a huge triumph. Within 8 months of the virus being in the United States, we have vaccines ready to go to market that are more than 90% effective and safe. Like vaccines are a true triumph of science. But of course, developing vaccines is another matter compared to delivering the vaccines and having people want to take the vaccines. Now, 20 to 30% of adults essentially do not want the vaccine or are mixed up about whether or not they want the vaccine. And the question is, why is that? Well, at some level, if you have gone all your life not being given reason to trust the health system, seeing that you and people in your group have more diabetes, have more hypertension, have more lung disease than other people in other groups, you have no reason to believe that the system is there to actually help you. Then why is it that then you should turn on a dime when somebody says, here's a vaccine, it's safe and effective, now you should take it? I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, not so fast. I'm not sure I want to take that vaccine because I haven't had reason to trust what you've told me before. So, I'm often asked, how do we get people to trust us about the vaccine now? And my answer is, we don't, because you don't get people to trust you overnight. Trust is built over time. So I think this should be a wake-up call for us that we need to ensure that we invest in people trusting the system. And to do that, we need to tend to all these things that I'm talking about.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Of course, vaccine resistors come in all shapes and sizes. Many in the wellness community, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. There are many reasons why people. I mean, the wellness community that's an interesting example, actually, of course, because you have groups of people who historically have been marginalized by mainstream medicine, and they have not been part of the conversation that mainstream medicine has with itself. And with that backdrop, why would one expect the wellness community all of a sudden to drop any walls of resistance and say, okay, that's fine, we'll do what mainstream medicine tells us? I have a colleague who says, if we disagree, it's because we haven't talked long enough. Mm-hmm. And I like that expression. And I think we not only have we not talked long enough, we actually haven't even started talking to many of these communities that now are putting up barriers and walls towards getting the vaccine.
Thank you. That's great. And, we've come to the point where we are going to open this to discussion and questions. But let me ask you one last question, which is, if there is one thing you hope that readers will think about or take action on after they read the book, what is that?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing, I would want readers to be clear in their mind that health is not healthcare, that the pandemic was a triumph of healthcare. Like clinical care during the pandemic has been excellent. The vaccines are in many respects an outcrop of healthcare, and it's been excellent. Our health has suffered terribly. We have had the highest number of deaths anywhere in the world. And when you just even realize that, you realize that what we need to create health is not the same as what we need to create healthcare. And we want both. We want excellent healthcare to look after us when we're sick. We want great vaccines, but we want health. And to do that, we need to demand health. And we need to have debates for mayor, for governor, for president, where the candidates are asked questions about, how is your housing plan going to affect people's health? let's talk about the transportation infrastructure bill that you have in mind and building all those houses. How is it going to affect people's health? And, you're talking about minimum wage. How is that going to affect health? So that we, the people, if I may use that term, may judge based on a value that we all hold dear, health. Like, it is a unifying value. I talk to all sorts of different audiences, and I've never had anybody who does not want their children to be healthy.
Yes.
Everybody wants their children to be healthy. So health should be a unifying value, and we need to understand what generates health so that we can actually demand it and expect it of the world around us.
Sandro, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. Can you please show the beautiful cover?
This is the actual cover. Arianna has the
beautiful cover.
I think the publisher did a lovely job with the cover, actually. Yes.
And also, for those of you who don't know, your newsletter, your weekly newsletter, is a must read. And highly recommended to everyone. And maybe you can tell everyone how to subscribe. It's free.
It's free. It's called The Healthiest Goldfish, and it's on Substack. You can Google it and you can subscribe.
And I now want to open it up to questions. And you've offered to take questions from everyone.
I'm happy to.
And so over to you.
All right. Well, we have a ton of questions. So yeah, if you would like to ask a question, make sure to click the Q&A button on your screen, ask away. We'll get through as many as we have time for. We have one from Cyrus. Cyrus asks, if I am worried about the waning support for public health, which should I be supporting more? My local school of public health or agents of social change, community organizing, political organizations? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Cyrus. I think the answer is all of the above, but to be a little bit less obvious about my answer, perhaps, I think you should support whoever you feel is moving you most, whoever you feel is most inhabiting the mission of building towards creating a healthier world. And that could be a school of public health, depending on your context, or it could be a community organization, depending on your context, because I think fundamentally all these organizations should be part of the patchwork that goes towards creating the kind of world we want. So I would support whichever one you feel is most consistent with your mission, and which one do you think is most effective?
Makes total sense. We have another question. It's a little long, but I think, how can we get action? I worry that optimism and good academic analysis are on the losing side. This asker references COVID deaths and recent elections. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we should put energy in preparing people to make better political choices right from kindergarten through college? Is there a book, movie, or TikTok about the dire importance of voting for the right people, what we need more?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. And I think I feel we put too much on elected political leaders. And I think, and I'm sure Arianna has thoughts about this as well, I think we expect or think that elected political leaders are leading, that they actually are making decisions that are independent of the people. But I don't think that's true. I actually think elected political leaders fundamentally are reflecting the broader public conversation. So as I see it, our job is to inflect the public conversation, whether it's through a book or through TikTok or whatever medium makes sense. It is these conversations that change what we expect and what we think is right. And I think political leaders will follow. And I mean, you see it right now in these current elections that happened in 2021. I mean, it is all about reflecting the public conversation. So I think our job is to inform the public conversation, which is why I think bookstores and this enterprise matters so much.
Oh, wonderful. We have another question. Can we somehow link human well-being and justice to the well-being and justice for the natural world? Yeah,
and Arianna actually made reference to this, and as did Brad in his introduction. And in my circles, this sort of goes under the umbrella of something called planetary health, which is the health of the whole ecosystem, the health of humans, the health of the environment, and it fundamentally recognizes that there can be no human health without the health of the planet. And I mean, right now we're in a moment of enormous awareness of this among sort of Gen Z, among Generation Z, and which is sort of wonderful. I mean, in some respects, perhaps it's a couple of generations too late, but it is a wonderful moment of recognizing that we are interlinked as species, as a plural species, and that a healthier human species is part of a healthier planet.
All right. We have a question from Angela. We've kind of already talked about this, but can you further expand on the differences between health and healthcare that you write about in the book, and why the latter should be adjusted to be more aligned with the former?
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer this slightly differently this time and challenge the audience. And my challenge to the audience is as follows. Next time you have a dinner party or at a bar or in whatever, as we move past, hopefully, the moment, start a conversation about health with your group. And you can say something like, oh, I was at the Harvard bookstore and I saw this conversation about health. And take out a watch and see how long it takes for someone to use the word healthcare interchangeably with health. And I promise it's in under 5 minutes. I actually recently did an interview where I explained this to the interviewer, and 2 minutes later, he actually used the word healthcare interchangeably with health just after we had this conversation. And I say this not critically. I actually say this because we make this mistake all the time. We actually, and I think it's an important mistake because we keep thinking that healthcare is health. So I'm challenging everybody to do this because I think part of our job together should be to clarify healthcare is important. Healthcare really matters, but it's only part of what generates our health. And we need to make that point over and over and over again.
Completely, sounds completely true to me. Kimberly asks, what might we do differently to facilitate a broader understanding of the science and a broader acceptance of vaccines or other remediation strategies?
Yeah. So let me answer this by using a metaphor which I use in the book, which is a ship metaphor. In the book I compare us to a ship, and it's a bit elaborate metaphor, but to make it simple, if you have a ship that has a hole in the hull, you don't fix the hole in the hull when you're going through the storm. When you go through the storm, you're holding on for dear life and trying not to sink. But when you're back in calm waters and the sun is shining, the water is calm, or you can get the ship out onto dry docks, you better fix the hole in the hull quickly before you get back into a storm, rather than saying, oh, I have a hole, but it doesn't really matter because the water is calm. And I think we make that mistake all the time. So the way to fix understanding of science, trust in vaccine, is not when we're going through the pandemic. It's actually when we're over the pandemic. So I actually think the hard work of getting people to understand science, to trust the products of science like a vaccine, will come once COVID is over. By the grace of God, we'll get through COVID, and then our mistake will be if we forget all about this. We say, oh, well, COVID's done. Let's don't worry about it. Vaccine, some people don't want vaccines. Not a big deal. That was yesterday's problem. No, it's yesterday's problem and tomorrow's problem.
All right. Here's an interesting question. How do you think a digital technology can help or hurt our efforts to address and demand health for Americans?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I mean, it's one can go on and on and on about how it can hurt. And I'll just comment on one of the ways it can hurt, and I'll talk about help. Is I think one of the challenges we've had in COVID is that this has been the first national emergency that has been experienced in a time when social media has essentially supplanted the public square. And social media isn't a substitute for the public square, because social media, of course, is an algorithmically driven medium, which is designed to elevate the angry, the emotions, the aggrieved, and the combative. That means that we have removed the public square in favor of a medium that essentially pits us against each other all the time. And that, I think, has been really problematic. And I think COVID emerged against that backdrop where we haven't quite figured out how to use social media like we as a society. It reminds me a little bit of 9/11. When September 11 terrorist attacks happened, it was the first national crisis experienced in a time of 24/7 news media. And similarly, that had particular effects on that conversation. This has particular effects on this conversation. So I do think that part of what we need to do is reckon with and learn how to do better with those media. Now, how can it help? I tend to think that the availability of digital approaches to democratize ideas, to connect us to one another, could help if we figure out how to really grapple with it, if we figured out how to bring us closer rather than to divide us.
Makes sense. I'm actually going to go back to your previous answer just for my own curiosity. I've heard a lot about historically, there tends to be almost a pandemic or epidemic amnesia, and there tends to be some often just forgetfulness of pandemics once they're over. And you, with your ship metaphor, talk about how crucial it is not to forget and how we need to fix the hull. How do we avoid this pandemic amnesia going forward as the pandemic starts to wane?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we avoid that by, I suppose in part that's why one writes a book like this, is to try to sort of have it on your shelf so it lingers beyond the pandemic moment. But I do think that that's a real danger. I actually hadn't heard the term epidemic amnesia, but it sounds about right. I think there's almost a natural human impulse, right, to say we've been through a bad thing together, that's over, thank God, now let's move on. The problem with that is that if you don't fix the problems that go with it, then the next one comes and it's going to be even worse. So I think we have a collective responsibility to not forget. And in some respects, I feel like forgetting dishonors the memory of those who have died. You know, I mean, nothing redeems the tragedy of all the lives lost, but surely it disrespects the lives lost if we do not remember and we don't try to do better.
That's a very good answer. Respect the dead, and also buy books from independent bookstores about pandemics. Good way to remember. We have a question from William. How would you incorporate the holistic ideas of health into primary and secondary school curriculums to reach a younger audience?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. I keep having on my to-do bucket list to write some of these ideas into a book that is for young adults, because I do actually think that it is important to get these ideas out there to citizens when they are in their most formative years, when they are teenagers, when they're really coming around to, you know, if you think about high school, I have a daughter in high school and son who just graduated from high school. You know, health really is physical education and, you know, don't drink, don't do drugs. That's roughly the extent of our health training. I think the world would be a much better place if this conversation was part of the health conversation in high schools. And so I actually think that there is a need to do that. There is a real space to fill. I haven't quite figured out how to intersect with that and how to contribute to filling that yet, but it's on my list.
I think it's a good thing to have on your list. I think it's very, very important to talk about the youth about this. We have a couple more questions. Are we on the right track if we are emphasizing the building of more gardens, urban farms, and teaching more people to grow their own food in their backyards, along with workshops on food as medicine, growing, teaching our youth how to grow food, our elders, etc.?
Yeah, I actually think the short answer is yes. And I would ward us away from sort of cynicism about these efforts, because I think it's easy to sort of be cynical about these efforts and say, well, what difference is going to make for one person to have one garden? But I actually think that the difference is, I actually see engagement like that as part of what I'm calling the conversation. By having young people recognize that they are part of the solution, they are part of that they can tangibly be part of creating a better world, healthy food for themselves, and be part of this planetary health argument that we made before. I think those young people are going to grow up to see themselves as having an active role in creating a context that generates health. So I actually think that, you know, if one could wave a magic wand and say every young person is part of creating a roof garden, that would be a really good thing for the world. And I think these are important efforts to move us in that direction.
I agree. I don't think there's any downside to gardens. We have a question from Radhika. Thank you for this amazing insight into health and COVID. What do you think is the main problem that needs to be fixed to prevent the next pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure that. I suppose let me flip the question over and just say what one solution would I propose, mm-hmm. and I suppose my one solution would be changing the narrative. One solution would be changing the narrative. You know, to go back to the Time magazine cover that Arianna started us with from 2017, we're not ready for the next pandemic. I want to see the 2022 Time magazine cover that says we're not ready for the next pandemic to be all about the forces that we've talked about in this conversation. Those are the forces that we need to change to be ready for the next pandemic. And my argument is until we deal with those forces, we're truly not ready for the next pandemic. So I think the challenge is that we continue to think that the solution is the vaccine, the surveillance, the stockpile. All of that is important, but none of that by itself is necessary. I apologize, none of that's sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient to prepare us for the next pandemic.
All right. Here's our final question for the night. How can we try to make these big changes in an age of political polarization? And are there ways to bridge the divide when it comes to our health?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I would challenge us all to see that as a core part of our responsibility. So what do I mean by that? If anybody speaking here to a Boston home crowd, if anybody's ever said, I don't understand how anybody could say, for example, vote for President Trump. Well, half the country voted for President Trump. That means we're not thinking hard enough. If anybody has said, I don't understand how anybody would not want to get the vaccine. Well, fully up to a third of the country doesn't want to get the vaccine. It means we're not thinking hard enough. So I'm actually posing this as a challenge to ourselves, and hope people don't mind. I'm talking from the Boston community, which we all know is much more heavily blue than it is red. That we actually have a responsibility to try to understand each other. And some things may seem outlandish to us, like how is it possible that people could possibly think that? Well, it is on us to understand each other. It is on us to understand how it's possible, because people are thinking that, and pretending it's not there or saying that it's impossible people think that is not a reflection of reality. So we have a responsibility to bridge that gap and try to understand how it is possible that people think these things that to us may seem so outlandish. That should be our challenge.
All right. I think that is all we have time for. That was the last question. Any final words, Dean Galea or Arianna?
I want to thank you so much for this incredibly important and urgent book, and thank the Harvard Bookstore for hosting it. And thank you for so brilliantly moderating the questions. Thank you so much. Please buy it and read it.
Arianna, thank you so very much. Audrey, Harvard Bookstore, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for being part of this conversation. Everybody have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder, if you would like to purchase a copy, there are links in the chat where you should absolutely purchase. Thank you all for being here tonight and supporting authors, publishers, any book selling in the Harvard Bookstore. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, have a great rest of your night. Take care.